I accept that in a developed community, the way in which the struggle between man and nature is conducted is through a necessary dialectical struggle. And without it, we would be a poorer world. It is necessary for environmentalists to struggle with development. This tension between development advocates and environmental advocates is a necessary tension. It produces better outcomes when we have that tension. So I accept the role of environmentalists in lobbying for and campaigning for and arguing for and diligently defending the need for proper regard for the environment. And we will strike good balance between environment and man through that process. However, the problem with mainstream environmentalism is when you have undeveloped regions and undeveloped peoples. In Cape York Peninsula, there is not an equal struggle between those who argue the case for man and those who argue the case for nature. There is not an equality of tension in an undeveloped region such as Cape York. In Cape York, those who argue the case for nature absolutely hold the day. They win the day. And there's no mature economy, there is no development that can defend the importance and necessity of development. People say that the Wet Tropics World Heritage Listing and the World Heritage Listing of the Great Barrier Reef has been nothing but a boon for tourism in Cairns and in northern Queensland. And so it has. And so it has. But they forget that Cairns was a mature economy at the time those regimes were put in place. We had a development interest that could hold its own. And of course, the more keen the tension, the better the outcomes. But in an undeveloped region such as Cape York Peninsula, there is no development. And therefore the Wilderness Society have been able to secure a prospect for the future that basically will mean a no-go zone for even minor development. The second problem with Western environmentalism is that it shifts costs onto powerless people. People who can't hold their own will end up bearing the costs of environmental protection. And that is what is being played out in Cape York Peninsula today. The people who can least afford a dampening of any economic development prospect are the people who are being asked by Australians to bear the costs of environmental protection. People who can least afford. And this principle is not just a local principle, it's worldwide. The shifting of cost to those who can least bear it and who have no means of resisting the cost is how this whole game will play out. In relation to global warming, it is a fact that the Western world would like to shift the cost to India and China. We would love to shift the cost of environmental responsibility to the 2 billion in Asia. But the truth is, they're not going to let us do it. They're insisting on their right to development as well. But you see, the position of Indigenous peoples trapped within Australia is that we don't have the bargaining power of India and China. We can't say no. So we are the first victims of cost shifting by the environmentalists to those who can least afford it. Let me tell you this. 99% of the vegetation in Cape York Peninsula is still pristine. The legislation for wild rivers and vegetation management in Queensland was directed at massive between bulldozers ball and chain clearing in central and western Queensland. That was what the Beattie legislation was directed against. Ball and chain clearing in central and western Queensland. There was no tree clearing problem in Cape York Peninsula. The Aboriginal reserve lands had hardly been cleared. There was no crisis of tree clearing and vegetation destruction in the Cape. But the Beattie government in 2001 handed the Aboriginal reserve lands of northern Queensland over to the Wilderness Society. No tree clearing on Aboriginal land. And we hardly made a murmur about it. We were so surprised. That was in 2001. And then in 2004, Wild Rivers was introduced during the middle of the campaign as a concept. And yet most of the wild rivers that were still pristine are on Aboriginal land. And they're pristine because they've been in these Aboriginal reserves for the last 150 years of European settlement. And again, we were completely uninformed about the commitment that the Beattie government had made to the green organisations to just hand over massive swathes of Aboriginal land to a quasi-national park regime. Not a sustainable development planning regime, a lock-up planning regime. And we see in these examples the fact that Indigenous peoples will be coerced into paying the environmental debts of the wider community. And the perverse situation is this. The state government provided a $200+ million compensation package for those affected by vegetation clearing. Aboriginal landowners gained not one red cent out of that $200 million. Not one Aboriginal landowner that I know of received any compensation under the established scheme. But more than that, the carbon economy that we face in the future is one in which the pastoralist or the farmer in Western Queensland who ball and chained their property in the old economy will have a place in the new carbon economy through forestry replantation and so on. They had a foothold in the old destructive economy, and they've got a foothold in the new carbon economy. Take the position of Indigenous landowners. They engaged in no destructive impact in the old economy, but they have no toehold whatsoever in the new carbon economy. Because the green groups and the state governments have locked up the land, they can't even be given credit for the vegetation that is now locked up.